Testing, awesome. All right, hi everyone. Good afternoon and welcome. We are excited to present Designing Costumes, the Ann Roth Way, in conjunction with the Bill Blass Fashion Design Speaker Series and the featured exhibition, The Art of the Character, Highlights of Glenn Close Costume Collection. We are thrilled to have Poe Durbin here with us today. On behalf of the students, staff, and volunteers at the IU Eskenazi Museum of Art, thank you for joining us. My name is Delaney. My pronouns are she, her. I'm a museum host, and I'm a student studying comprehensive design, and I'm just happy to be here. Also with me today are Kelly Gillette Richardson, curator of the Elizabeth Sage Historic Costume Collection in the Eskenazi School of Art, Architecture, and Design, and Laura Shepper, public experiences manager here at the Eskenazi Museum of Art. First, we wish to acknowledge and honor the Indigenous communities native to this region and recognize that Indiana University Bloomington was built on Indigenous homelands and resources. We recognize the Miami, Delaware, Potawatomi, and Shawnee people as past, present, and future caretakers of this land. Today's program includes time for questions after the presentation. The program, including the Q&A, is being recorded. For updates of when recordings are released, subscribe to the museum news through the website. Emergency exits are located to the right of the screen, as well as the doors you entered through. The Art of the Character, Highlights from Glenn Close Costume Collection, is presented in partnership with the Elizabeth Sage Historic Costume Collection in the Sydney Lewis Eskenazi Museum of Art, Architecture, and Design. The exhibition is co-curated by Kelly Gillette Richardson, curator of the Sage Fashion Collection, and Galina Olmsted, assistant curator of European and American art at the Eskenazi Museum of Art. The exhibition is on view through November 14th. At this time, we would like to say a big thank you for your generous support of the exhibition and catalog that it was provided in part by the Indiana University Foundation, Wells House Society, and Women's Philanthropy Leadership Council, the Office of the Bicentennial at Indiana University, the Pressman family, Dale Ellen Leff, and Kimberly and John Simpson. Again, thank you for helping us bring this truly spectacular exhibition to life. The accompanying catalog for this exhibition is a beautiful hardback published by Scala Publishers in association with the Eskenazi Museum of Art. Information and the link to the catalog have been shared in the chat. The Eskenazi Museum values its students, and I have the great privilege of introducing today's speaker. Poe Durbin is an award-winning professor of the costume design at the University of California, Irvine, where she heads the graduate and undergraduate design studies, recruits MFA candidates, oversees the graduate curriculum and undergraduate honors students, and mentors student designers. Durbin received her MFA from UCLA's School of Theater, Film, Television, and her BA from Vanderbilt University, with post-bachelorette studies at the Royal Opera in London. She has held teaching positions at the University of California, Irvine, UCLA, San Diego State University, and Washington University. Her areas of expertise include costume design for theater, film, television, theme parks, and opera, history of performance costume design, historical fashion, museum curatorship, and fashion studies, and costume design, as well as material culture, costume studio techniques, and contemporary practices in design education. Durbin's publications include forthcoming, the Costume Design Toolkit, the designs of Ann Roth, and numerous journal articles, book chapters, and encyclopedia articles. She speaks regularly at museums and conferences on fashion and costume scholarship. Durbin's creative research includes designs for the South Coast Repertory, the Old Globe Theaters, St. Louis Repertory, Cincinnati Playhouse, Portland Center Stage, Shakespeare Center, LA, and Playmakers Repertory, as well as international theaters. She has costumed Tom Hanks, Martin Short, William Shatner, Helen Hunt, Eric Idle, Julia Roberts, Tessa Thompson, Ewan McGregor, and Kenneth Branagh. Please join me in welcoming Poe Durbin.
I'm going to remove my mask just for speaking tonight. So thank you. We are a small but mighty band. I would love to know why you're interested in Ann Roth, since there's so few of you. I can take a minute to find out. So who knows anything about Ann Roth? Just raise your hand. Oh, okay. And why do you know something about Ann Roth? Oh, you know all about Ann Roth. Okay. I saw another hand in the back too. Okay, wonderful. And your hand is raised for the same reason. Oh, you love movies. Okay, wonderful. The reason I ask is that Ann Roth is one of the well-kept secrets of the movie business. She's done every movie you've ever seen, but you wouldn't necessarily know that. So let me just adjust this. No other costume designer can compare their career to Ann Roth's. She is equally at home on Broadway and in Hollywood films. She's 90 years old and still going strong. And she's in pre-production for Wicked right now. She has designed hundreds of plays, television, and film. She designed 10 Broadway shows in 2018 and 2019, just before the pandemic closed the theaters. The range of those designs makes it hard to believe they were created by the same person. This one is Gary, a sequel to Titus Andronicus. It was directed by the fiercely experimental Taylor Mack, and it stars Nathan Lane as one of the two servants tasked with cleaning up after the bloody Civil War that's mentioned in Shakespeare's play. You can see that these costumes are heavily exaggerated, and it looks like they are part of a painting. Then there's King Lear, starring Glenda Jackson playing King Lear as the tragic king. To Kill a Mockingbird, a period piece set in the mid-1930s. The Prom, a comic musical about empowerment. The Iceman Cometh with Denzel Washington, set in 1912. The melancholy masterpiece musical Carousel, set in the 1870s, and Meteor Shower, which is a hilarious comedy written by Steve Martin. So to open all of these in succession means she was planning all of them years in advance, and she was working on all of them at exactly the same time. Roth started her film career as part of the 1960s New Wave cinema movement, working with several early directors of this movement, such as Mike Nichols and John Schlesinger. Hallmarks of New Wave include an emphasis on realism, sidelined characters or maligned characters, and using actual locations to shoot on. Centered in New York, the filmmakers proudly contrasted themselves to what they said was the artificiality of Hollywood studios working on sealed sound stages and carefully constructed backlots. 3 well-known early New Wave works cemented Roth's reputation for specializing in compelling street characters: The World of Henry Orient, Midnight Cowboy, and Klute. Klute, oops, I need to go back one. Thank you. Klute, starring Jane Fonda as a streetwalker, attracted notice in the fashion press, who reported Roth's use of street styles had influenced mainstream fashion. Until the 1960s and 70s, trends began with fashion designers and trickled down to street versions of high fashion. In the 60s, this reversed and trends started in the street, trickling up to fashion. Ann's costumes, inspired by real street prostitutes in New York, introduced those street styles to millions of young fashion followers at just the right time. Some of the fashion press went so far as to wail that Ann Roth had killed Hollywood glamour. Roth did characterize herself as the antithesis of Hollywood. In 1975, she told the LA Times, "I'm not interested in whether the leading ladies prefer to wear blue or red. That went out in the 60s. In the old days, the stars dressed according to the studio image. Now they dress according to the director and the script." It's worth noting, let me go back one. It's worth noting in the center image that Jane Fonda agreed to go braless, which is something we don't think of today very much, but it was part of the feminist social conversation at the time. And it was certainly a bold for a film that was going to be in wide release. It depicts a streetwise realism that had not been shown before. Anne had already stirred comment with Barbara Streisand's costumes for The Owl and the Pussycat. Streisand played a dim-witted actress who also dabbled in prostitution. While this costume seems outrageous with pink hands on the breasts and a spangled heart shape on the panties, it was inspired by actual 1940s burlesque costumes. They thought of it first. I can't resist showing you both versions of the movie poster. The one in the center is the original, and the yellow version on your left removed the hands and the heart. Many American communities refused to advertise this original costume. Actors, directors, and other costume designers describe Ann Roth as a national treasure. I'd like to show a clip that I think describes how actors feel about working with her. Ann was honored at the International Film Festival in the Hamptons. On the plane, Meryl Streep wrote a poem describing Anne. This is just a small part of it.
It's called An Ode to Anne, or What's Owed to Anne by All of Us. We celebrate here Anne of Roth.
It's frozen there.
Yeah.
Okay. Great.
It's called An Ode to Anne, or What's Owed to Anne by All of Us.
There it goes.
We celebrate here Anne of
Thank you.
Roth, whose marriage of genius and cloth, of patterns and tints, of solids and prints, makes her of designers the boss. What makes her unique? Curiosity. Her collaborative reach, reciprocity. She's a pain in the neck, a reality check, and her quality of mind, luminosity. In the fitting room, she has plied me with chocolates and hardmints, then squeezed me in foundation garments, inspired me with song, then said, "You'd look strong in a coat made of cheap furry varmints." Right? That was the hours. The coat was made up of more than one goat. The effect was pure Annie, and it covered my fanny. Her couture is very far from haute.
This last statement is actually very significant. Her couture is very far from haute. Although Anne does and can create glamorous garments, they are achievable glamour that a person could create on their own with believable everyday appeal. And I think your exhibition does an excellent example of showing that, showing Ann Roth's designs next to James Atchison and Judiana Makovsky, who create beautiful haute couture and spectacle as well. Anne just won an Oscar in 2020 for Ma Rainey's Black Bottom, a story that takes place on a hot Chicago day in July 1927. How many people have seen this film? Excellent. Okay, good. Ma Rainey, as you know, was an acclaimed blues singer who earned her living touring the South. Anne captures the perfect combination of showbiz and the stark way that Black artists were treated. Appearances are not always what they seem. In fact, Anne asked that Ma Rainey's wigs be made of horsehair, as the real Ma could not afford expensive human hair wigs. While the audience does not know this detail, they can tell the wigs are stiff and they do not behave like human hair. It steps down the glamour of a sparkly stage costume with this realistic detail. The muggy heat also makes her makeup smudge to create a portrait of an artist who labored in a society that made things harder than they should have. The smoky eye for stage makeup was certainly fashionable, but as the heat builds, it takes on a haunting resemblance to two black eyes, a fitting metaphor for the way white producers took advantage of black singers in the 1920s. So what is an Ann Roth design? Given her amazing range of work, is it possible to pronounce some hallmarks? Given Roth's method of working, I think she prefers cloaking her talents in mystery because she is so devoted to creating the magic rather than featuring the magician. And you saw how she cringed getting an award. This is true every time she receives another award. She just wants to melt into the floor. And there may not be a way to verbalize what she does. Her costume design is an innate artistic response, just like writing or composing music. Others corroborate this theory, such as producer Scott Rudin, who said she is as much a storyteller as the writer. She makes the story play. The first element is working with friends. This is how she describes her own career. She works with producers, directors, and actors over and over, and describes the value of this in her epilogue to the excellent Art of Character exhibition book that you all have produced. It's beautiful. Friends have developed a shorthand. They know what questions to ask. So she can leap into a project with a great body of understanding, having worked with the producers, the directors, and many of the actors before. And Anne's circle of friends is unparalleled. She has worked with many of the serious movers and shakers in entertainment. She has not sought work for decades. It seeks her. Her friend, director George Wolfe, reached out to Anne for Ma Rainey's Black Bottom. You can see him here in the center. She said, they called me and I was in Europe. Now George is a friend. Denzel and I have known each other for years. And Viola I've worked with before. It was a familiar group that I love, but I was in France on the 23rd of June and the picture started shooting on the 8th of July. So she said no. Nevertheless, they talked her into it, and she soon found herself costuming a period piece on a snappy schedule. The next element is fidelity to story. Ma Rainey also demonstrates the second element, and she interprets absolute fidelity to the story through several means that we'll look at. First, she sees the big picture of the story. She creates an extensive backstory for each character, figuring out where they would obtain their clothing. She's fearless, putting old dirty clothing on stars to transform them into their characters. Early in the 1970s, she began using real vintage clothing in her films or recreating them exactly. This is common practice now, but it was not when she started. Historical accuracy was not the intention of most film designers. Featuring their stars was their intention. This scene shows Ma Rainey performing in a tent show. I'm interested in the extras that we see in the background. Anne has costumed each and every one correctly, noting that every woman is wearing a pair of stockings and a girdle, and the stockings have a seam up the back, true to the period. They're wearing a correct dress and hat, and all the men have correct shirts, suspenders, and pants. Viola Davis described filming these scenes. She noted even during the tent scene, which must have had over 100 extras, and went up to each and every one of those extras and had her hands on them. She explained where each part of their costume came from and what it meant to be in that tent. They listened intently. Ann Roth is not just a costume designer, she's an artist and she's a teacher. That's what makes her extraordinary. When Anne talks about her approach to period costume, she will contrast what she considers her best work, 1975's The Day of the Locust, with The Sting, released in 1973. The Sting was a Hollywood blockbuster that glamorized the hottest leading men duo of the day, Robert Redford and Paul Newman. Both films take place in the 30s, both filmed in the mid 70s, and both stories feature larger than life characters. The Sting costumes are heavily influenced by 1970s fashion details that romanticize those bankable leading men. The puffy newsboy cap, the smooth suit fabric with hard graphic stripe, the large ties that are more 70s than 30s. Nods to the current era are common in many Hollywood films as they try to make stars appealing to their contemporary audience and taste, no matter what period the story takes place in. Here you can see The Day of the Locust on the left and The Sting on the right. The Day of the Locust does not look dated to us because it is more true to 1930s style. It looks like it was filmed in the 1930s. It's less influenced by contemporary taste in the 1970s. By contrast, The Sting looks a little old-fashioned to us now in 2021. I'd like to show other characters from this film, many of them extras. Roth has created complete and unique characters for every single one of them. Of particular interest is the Natalie dressed man in the pinstripe suit and flat cap. He wears a vintage 1930s pinstripe suit. When we compare that to the one Robert Redford wears, we can see the 1970s star quality approach is even more apparent. These extras show Roth's devotion to crafting real people. Not one of these looks like a fashion advertisement for the 1930s. This collection of unique characters defines the entire world in very fine detail. The third element of an Ann Roth design is impeccable research. She describes herself as the last of the big pains in the neck when it comes to historical accuracy. This is true for every film and play that she does. She absolutely delights in digging up historic suppliers and importing things from around the globe. She has created a network of artisans who make everything imaginable. She also stores period costumes. She has completely filled a barn on her property and taken over several buildings in town just to store her large costume collection of vintage pieces. I'd like to play a short clip from an interview with CBS Sunday Morning because it shows her archive. Let's hear about researching in her own voice.
We are in
Pennsylvania, eastern Pennsylvania.
It's here that she and her late husband raised their daughter, and where Roth keeps her vast research library. Huge volumes just for the military uniforms in the Civil War epic Cold Mountain.
Where the jackets were made, where the wool was woven, where the wool was dyed, where it was washed.
Why did you need to know that?
Because you do. I mean, you can't not know it.
As the archive of her sketches shows, every detail matters to Roth.
Every detail does matter to Roth. And the more obscure the detail, the more she delights in it to create a unique world. Another example of her research approach is The Village by M. Night Shyamalan. This village is completely cut off from the world. In case you watch it, I'm not going to give away the twist because it is a Shyamalan film, but they cannot access any other communities around them. Anne figured they must make their own clothing from scratch. And so she used fabrics made by heritage weavers who still operated the old-fashioned looms. To create the patterns, she used 19th century wallpaper designs as inspiration, and the costume department hand-stamped many of the fabrics for a do-it-yourself aesthetic. You can see a fabric in the lower corner, that yellow fabric. The hand stamping is pretty apparent. And she expands this network of sources with every project. She spent months researching the fabrics for the musical Shuffle Along, set in the 1920s and 30s. She's particularly proud of discovering an historic fabric called tarlatan, a thin, stiffened cotton. It's like a cheesecloth, but it's been stiffened. and it causes skirts to puff out but still be very light. Anne expressed delight that Zelda Fitzgerald would have worn this very fabric, and she found a woman in England who still manufactures it the same way they did in the 1920s. She's famous for insisting her actors wear reproductions or actual vintage underwear that would have been worn in the period. It affects the way the actors walk, hold themselves, and think of their characters. Anne won her first Oscar for Places in the Heart, and Sally Fields also won Best Actress, playing Edna Spaulding, a widow learning to run a farm during the Depression. At home, she dressed in work clothes, but here we see her in town to ask the bank for a loan. Anne made Fields wriggle into a stiff girdle from the 1930s, as all respectable women appearing in polite society would have done at that time. In the 1930s, it was very difficult to be a woman in a man's world. Sally Fields later revealed the formality of dressing in a clammy rubber construction that made her sit in a more formal way, made her move differently and feel differently about the humiliating moment of her deflated pride. And this screen capture from the English Patient, Catherine Clifton, played by Kristen Scott Thomas, is wounded in an airplane crash. As she's being pulled out of the crash, we can see the vintage slip and lace showing through the sheer dress, adding even more to the fragility of the moment. This photo shows a dresser helping Nicole Kidman dress for Cold Mountain. That takes place during the Civil War. She wears a reproduction actual corset that affects her posture as Ada Monroe. Most costumes today create period corsetry. The really surprising detail for me is the thigh-high stockings tied with garters as they would have been. This detail does not show in the film, but it would affect the movement and sensibility as Ada slides into poverty, has to abandon her fine wardrobe and work in the fields. Another example of the Ann Roth design is strong character definition. She'll make very bold decisions on behalf of the stars. She's fearless when collaborating with stars and is not cowed by their megawatt power. During preparation for The Midnight Cowboy, she wanted to give Dustin Hoffman dirty, threadbare costumes as Ratso Rizzo, the downtrodden street dweller. She even added weights to his shoes to create a halting gait, and you can see he's holding one foot differently. She hollowed out the heel and had a weight put into it to create that. But Hoffman had just experienced stardom in The Graduate and was very reluctant to tarnish this image. She did get her way, and she says his costumes were never washed during shooting, adding even more realistic discomfort. This role proved that Dustin Hoffman was a formidable actor, and the movie went on to be listed as number 36 in the American Film Institute list of greatest films of all time. Not many costume designers would win a contest of wills with their star. She is smart and often turns out to be right. Anne created one of her great signature looks early in Meryl Streep's career. Director Mike Nichols asked that Karen Silkwood, who is a real person, be portrayed as a blonde. But Roth convinced Streep to become a brunette. Not only did she do it, but according to Anne, Streep gamely dyed her own hair in the sink the night before shooting started. The next day, Anne dressed her in a working class outfit, put a beer in her hand, and leaned her up against a car. The director walked right past his leading lady without even recognizing her. Not many costume designers would be bold enough to spring a surprise like that on your director the first day of shooting. Roth is not afraid to make those bold statements, but she also employs less obvious techniques to define character. She will create a character closet mixing and matching items to create different ensembles. In Julie and Julia, she arranged Julia Child's costumes into two categories. The first she called Not an Outfit. Here we see Julia Child in a store in Paris in Not an Outfit. She was not interested in shopping like the other American wives she met here. Her ensemble is not matched. It looks casual, like she doesn't care much about what she's wearing, and it's not particularly fashionable. The opposite of Not an Outfit is an outfit. Here we see Child again at a luncheon with other women wearing outfits that are carefully matched. We will also see Julia Child mix the same jackets, blouses, and skirts in several combinations, just like real people do, who must dress from their own closet, not the vast resources of a studio warehouse. In The World According to Garp, Glenn Close played Jenny Fields, a single mother and nurse who becomes a feminist icon. I'm struck by the particular glow of strength we see in this actor and character. Roth and Glenn were confined to a nurse uniform for much of the film. And instead of other things, Roth poured her energy into the many sweaters and jackets that Jenny wore over that uniform. I'm particularly struck by this particular one. It is a thick tweed short jacket reminiscent of World War II Eisenhower jackets. It's a strong character statement of armor over the uniform of nurturing. Anne finds these characters in the fitting room with her actors. Several people have noted that she never talks to the actor about what they're going to wear. She talks to the actor about what the character is. She uses storytelling to communicate what she's thinking. I attended fittings with Anne for the Broadway production of The Death of a Salesman, and she allowed me to record some of them. The Actors Union, however, was not aware of this, so I'm going to play you a clip, but I'm not going to reveal any names. But I will say this fitting was for the character of Stanley, who is a waiter in a restaurant. You'll hear other voices as well. You'll hear Anne and Stanley and a tailor and a design assistant. This conversation came about because the actor asked some moments before if he should roll up his shirt sleeves to wait on tables.
And I think you could roll your sleeves up if you wanted to. I think I would. There's a tradition of sort of Irish pubs that were very clean and sawdust, and on St. Patrick's Day, the ice in the urinal was green. I mean, they had a certain pride of, and that was very true of the Broadway around Manhattan. All the 8th Avenue, you know, on the edge of 8th Avenue,
And just face me for a second.
were the docks. And across from the docks were the teamsters, the horses and teams. And then the bars started. And the tradition was pride. And there were people were flying out having
That's Hell's Kitchen.
yes.
This is
and
6th
all
Avenue.
the way down when it came east. And down, and all those places with steaks and lamb chops, and eventually they became tougher and tougher, but always after the theater night.
Yeah.
They were eccentric places. They were only New York. And I think this is one of those places. But you still call the Mr. Loman, you're doing this?
Yeah.
Yeah. You know, it's a very sort of altar boy, bartender, that world. It's sort of a world of nice convention, manners. sewed your shirt would be immaculate.
I'm saying not to roll my sleeves.
No, I'm just saying if you roll them then neat and you're like a neighborhood guy. I mean, they feel very comfortable with a person like you.
I think so.
This is pure Ann Roth right here. That sums her up in a nutshell. This conversation illustrates why she has been described as a novelist. I've edited the conversation for today. It was actually much longer, all in response to the idea of whether you should roll up your sleeves or not. The final result was that he did roll up his sleeves. The deciding factor would be that so the waiter's mother would not have to scrub food stains off the cuffs every day. Another element of an Ann Roth design is that she creates poetry from the everyday. This slide compares two versions of Mildred Pierce. The 1945 original was designed by Edith Head, the remake in 2011 by Ann Roth. Mildred becomes a wealthy woman through hard work. She's a self-made millionaire. Roth's Mildred reflects the truth of many self-made people. She doesn't spend much on herself. She is well-dressed, but she does not overdo it. Edith Head's job in this film was to feature the magnificent Joan Crawford in a manner the studio wished, complete with stunning fur. Studio boss Jack Warner, among others, had come from a family of furriers, and he was very famous for putting fur as an aspirational garment into films that people would see. The film Working Girl finds many poetic moments in the everyday. Sigourney Weaver's character is a successful woman who went to the right schools and made all the smart moves to succeed in business. There is a lovely entrance where the camera lingers on her as she strides confidently past all the secretaries. Her sleek appearance suggesting the force of speed, and her coat resting on her shoulders like a superhero cape. Melanie Griffith's character begins as a secretary. Anne captured how working women really dressed to commute through Manhattan in public transportation, wearing sneakers for comfort and mobility. Then they changed into their high heels when they got to the office. Griffith's Tess McGill eventually becomes a boss, and her gradual transformation through costume is its own poetic device. I urge anyone studying costume design to track this film scene by scene to understand the perfect clockwork. I'll show The English Patient again, also poetic, one of the most poetic films I think made in quite some time. Roth combines fragile fabrics with sturdy safari fabrics. There's an ease in the way that Kristen Scott Thomas as Catherine Clifton wears a beat up hat. But her feminine costumes are made of incredibly thin, fragile fabrics, such as the lace dress at the right, which is see-through, and found a vintage tablecloth to make into that dress. The 1985 crime drama Jagged Edge combines many of Anne's design traits. The costumes for the character of Teddy Barnes are a nod to the 1930s, although the story takes place in the 1980s. There was a small 1930s revival at the time, but some of us might remember in the 1980s, many women wore a baggier style of suit with long jackets and large shoulder pads. Now that that style's back, it's called a boyfriend jacket. We are wearing it again. This story is an homage to film noir, so the 1930s flavor adds to the genre storytelling. But more importantly, the silhouette adds strength to Teddy's character. Here we can see a patch detail near the shoulders that is reminiscent of a suit designed by Elsa Schiaparelli in 1939. Roth also created a character closet for Teddy. We see her cycle through her wardrobe wearing two different blouses with this tan suit, ivory and navy blue. And here we see more comparisons to the 1930s and 1980s, how Anne might have combined details to create this outfit that is contemporary, but with a unique vintage flair. This design makes Teddy look capable, all the more shocking then when she discovers the client she defended was really a killer after all. The navy blouse appears again with a navy suit. Not only is this cycling true to life, but it adds focus to the timeline. We innately feel, when you watch the film, you get the idea of how long this trial drags on in the courtroom because she's starting to repeat her clothing, just like we would do. And here we can see more details from the 1930s and 80s combined to create this navy suit style. I'd like to end by looking at the Stepford Wives. The story structure is somewhat similar to The Village in that it is an isolated community. The story takes place in the modern era, but models itself after a nostalgic time in the early 1960s. This film is not just a period piece, but a character study of women who transform from capable urbanites to empty robotic beings. Here we see Nicole Kidman's character arriving, a refugee from the modern urban world. She is a stark contrast to Glenn Close as Claire Wellington, who embodies the nostalgic aesthetic of womanhood. She is perfectly dressed and her figure is nipped in with a foundation garment. We soon discover all is not right in Stepford. All the women are robots. Here we see the robotic women. I chose this lineup because it shows you how perfectly they all match together and how their hemlines all skim at about the same length on each woman, lending to kind of the cookie cutter feeling. Claire Wellington wears a series of costumes that show she is playing a part. At first, this very fragile feminine dress, as we see her as the ideal wife. But we also see her in a red power suit for the 4th of July celebration. But the suit is made of a soft, shiny dress fabric, not tailoring fabric. It turns into a mirror-like surface. There's a great deal of irony in celebrating Independence Day when trapped in Stepford. Claire is the shining light of this world of pretense. Here we see Nicole Kidman as Joanna trying to join Stepford society on the left, but her attempt is half-hearted. Her costume is fragile but deflated and awkward, not an outfit, compared to the robotic women who wear outfits. And this is an example of why actors love working with Anne. She is always on their side. This costume cleverly covers Bette Midler's upper arms, a part many mature women prefer not to reveal. A striped scarf threads around the arms through the neckline and then wraps to the back in a giant bow that makes her look like tropical gift wrap. And then the final dress is pure Ann Roth. She has created a happy yellow illusion that embodies the 1950s new look with a tiny waist and pronounced hips. The stripes on the bodice have been cut away from the fabric and stitched over the entire bodice over the seams. So the bodice fabric had to be dyed to match the striped fabric of the skirt. This is a true belle of the ball ensemble. The yellow striped fabric is one that we associate more with drapery or curtains, not so much with fashion. Not many designers faced with making a ball gown would go for this stripe. There's something off about it, even though it's a ball gown. And as expected, the world comes crashing down for Claire Wellington, and this dream dress demonstrates how intoxicating the illusions were and how far was her fall. Ann Roth creates poetry from the everyday and makes every day glamorous. Today, I've barely scratched the surface of her impressive career and formidable talents. I will end in her words. She said, "Truly great costumes amplify the truth of the tales they tell with compassion and specificity. They should distill and heighten reality. After all, we only have 2 hours to illuminate entire lives." Thank you. Thank you.
For your insights into Ann's career. And does anyone, I was going to microphone, but we're a small group.
Huh.
Have some questions they would like to ask Holly? Oh, I forgot.
Oh, we do need the mic.
Yes,
Ah,
yeah,
right.
so. You must have some questions. Anyone? Pardon me. Questions for Holly? Questions about Anne? Questions about costuming?
Yes, in the back.
Okay.
Question. I'll repeat the question for the recording. The question is, does Ann Roth do much of the stitching herself? And the answer is no. I'm not even sure how well she could sew. She started her career as a scene painter, but she obviously learned a lot about clothing. She was an assistant to Irene Sheriff, and so she learned a lot about clothing being in fittings with one of the great masters. There's no time in the world to design so many shows and actually sit down and do anything yourself. So most of these, if they're not vintage garments, they are contracted out to the commercial shops in New York and London and other places, depending on where she's shooting. And Eric Winterling is one of her favorite shops. The other one is Rosie Zingalis at Studio Rouge. And she will have a show that will be so large, it will essentially be in every shop in New York. And so that is how she spends a great deal of her day. She has so many projects going on, she has to have a driver. So she gets to leap out of the car, run upstairs, do the fittings, leap back into the car, go to another shop. And she makes these rounds all day to keep all of her shows on track.
Sounds like a superwoman.
Is a superwoman.
I do have a question. Is there any particular costume designer that Ann Roth admires the work of?
Oh, good question. So for the recording, oh, it's on the recording. Yes. Okay. So Piero Tosi is the one that Anne admires most, an Italian designer. And she has collected a great number of books about him and things about his works and artifacts from him.
Anyone else?
Besides Ann Roth? Oh, I don't. The more I watch them, the more fascinated I become with their literary value of the costume design. As I was describing, whenever I speak about her, I speak less about the technicalities of it and more about the literary description, because that's how she thinks. And you heard her talk. Every fitting is full of stories like that. And she is a completely avid reader. She has read every book that's ever won the Man Booker Prize. She just tasks herself to do that. She's constantly reading great novels. And so that's how her mind really thinks, is in literary terms.
Anyone else? I'd like to ask about that costume collection that she has in her barn. So
Yes.
is this what she is pulling? Is this inspiration, but also things that she'll pull for productions?
Both. She has secret suppliers that keep things aside because they know Ann Roth might want this someday. So she's got people all over sending her things. So she will collect preemptorily as well as for her films. And so she does keep many of them. If they're hers to begin with, she keeps them. And so she slowly accumulated a huge stock. At first still filled her studio in New York, and then garments were hanging everywhere. And everyone had to decamp to her farm in Pennsylvania and convert the barn. And then in no time she outgrew the barn. Then she took over 2 buildings in town. So it's huge. I wonder what's going to become of it. I would love to know when she decides to no longer use it. Do you know the answer to that question? She has one formal business partner, Jane Greenwood, who is a partner in the studio business, although Jane no longer works out of that studio. So now how much of that might belong to Jane Greenwood, I'm unclear. How much of it belongs to anyone? She has a number of assistants that have gone on to be major designers in their own right. And so she has quite a coterie of people who might have an interest in it.
Great. I was also going to ask if you could talk about her. I imagine she's still designing now. Are there recent projects that we're going to see
Yes.
soon?
Yes. So the recent one is she's designing the movie Wicked, which has been tempting us for years to be released, and it keeps getting put off. It's been caught in pandemic and various forms of politics. At one point, the studio or the director, the director was replaced. And the second director actually put out on Twitter a casting ideas, who should play the characters in Wicked, to get everyone all whipped up. It's still in pre-production, and I don't know when it's going to release. They won't say. They're keeping it very close to the vest.
Anyone else? No? Well, thank you. That was a fascinating look into the work of Ann Roth. And I'd like to have a show our appreciation to Holly, and thank you for coming tonight.
Thank you.
Oh, that's okay. You're good. All right. Thank you so much, Holly, for talking with us today. We invite you all to experience this exhibition in person. It is on view through November 14th. We hope you'll consider joining us for more programs during this featured exhibition. Join us at 5 p.m. on November 4th during First Thursday to learn about the costuming and construction of dangerous liaisons. Join dress historian, collector, and independent scholar Abby Cox for an inquiry into the fantasy and reality of designing and making 18th century costumes for the screen and stage. Like tonight's program, this talk too is presented in conjunction with the Bill Blass Fashion Design Seminar Series in the Eskenazi School of Art, Architecture, and Design. And if there are any IU students in the audience, RSVP for an exclusive behind-the-scenes experience for IU students. In November, enjoy a look at the inside of the art of the character and conversation with Galina Olmsted, Assistant Curator of European and American Art. How does an exhibition come to life? What is it like to work on a project like this? And what is different about organizing exhibition during a pandemic? You're welcome to bring your own questions. No experience is necessary. This project meets you where you are. Everything we do here at Indiana University Eskenazi Museum of Art is made possible by philanthropy. So thank you to our friends who have made our gifts to our annual fund and special exhibitions fund. Their support enables us to share exhibitions and free programs like this one you've experienced today. If you've enjoyed this event or are just as excited for the show as we are, please visit the museum's website to make a donation. Gifts big and small impact all of our students and border communities. From the Eskenazi Museum of Art, take care and have a good evening.